for the glory of old state, for her founder strong and great, for the future that we wait. Raise the song, raise the song.
Sing our love and loyalty,
Sing our hopes that bright and free.
rest, O Mother dear, with thee, all with thee, all with thee.
Where else would you rather be? Welcome to the Penn State Alumni Association's The People of Penn State podcast. I'm your host, Paul Clifford. Each week on the podcast, you can expect to hear the voices of Penn Staters talking about what they're passionate about, and you can expect to feel the pride and the power of the Penn State network. You can find the People of Penn State podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your podcast app of choice. Subscribe and give us a rating. Ratings and reviews are really the best way to help other people find the People of Penn State podcast. And so go ahead and drop us a rating and give us a review and share the podcast with your friends. We want to have other Penn Staters listening in to the great stories that we are sharing. And we have another one lined up for you today. Today we're talking with Paula Trimble. She is the Policy Chief and Director of Small Business Programs at the Space Development Agency, a part of the U.S. Department of Defense. Now 2 years old, the Space Development Agency is building a space-based architecture to provide next-generation space capabilities to meet the needs of the joint warfighter. At SDA, Paula is driving policy solutions to reduce barriers in the acquisition process and enable small businesses and startups to work more easily with the federal government. Paula has always been attracted to disruptive organizations at the nexus of policy and technology. After graduating from Penn State in 1998 with a degree in journalism, which we're going to get into that. We're going to ask her how journalism led her to working in space. She started her career in Washington, D.C. as a reporter at Space News and at Federal Computer Week. She then moved into public service, working in the space offices at the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Federal Aviation Administration, where she helped to promote the expansion of commercial markets for GPS, satellite communications, satellite imagery, and space launch. And then in 2006, Paula spent more than 8 years overseeing prototyping and experimentation efforts in the DoD's Rapid Reaction Technology Office. Most recently, she was a senior principal at Lewis Burke Associates, leading the lobbying firm's national security practice in support of university researchers, scientific societies, and national research institutes. She engages with policymakers on issues of interest to academia and small business across the research enterprise. Welcome, Paula Trimble, to the People of Penn State podcast. Paula, how are you today?
Good morning, Paul. I'm great. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited about our conversation and get to know a little bit about your background and about the work you're doing today.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it.
First, let's start. How did you become a Penn Stater?
Well, as a New Yorker, I don't know that Penn State was the obvious choice for me, but I was looking for a school with a journalism program and a student-run daily newspaper, and Penn State definitely hit those marks. So on our family visit to Penn State, I had toured the Collegian, and I went to what was then the College of Communications. And I met with one of the advisors there, and we sat down, and she heard about what I was interested in. And I went on to some other meetings, and she came and found me and said, I know this journalism program will hit your mark, but I found a minor for you that I think is absolutely perfect. And it was the Science, Technology, and Society minor, because I was very interested in those benefits and costs of scientific and technical innovation and wanted to, sort of pursue that bent with my reporting. And so she brought me in to meet with one of the professors while I was there. And it really was just sort of the linchpin in the whole thing. I mean, once I saw that, the honors program, the Daily Collegian, I was sold. So that's how I ended up at Penn State. Luckily, it was only a 4-hour drive from where I lived in New York, so I could get home easily. But I just, I gained so much out of my experience.
Let's kind of stick there for a second. What was the intended outcome from coming to Penn State? You came with journalism in mind. It seemed like you had the science and technology angle, more of maybe technical reporting in the journalism world. But when you graduated, what was the dream job?
I was going to work for the New York Times. I wanted to be a reporter at the New York Times, and I completely expected my career to take that path. I thought, I'm going to work my way up in journalism. I'll start out as a copy editor. I'll do some reporting, and one day I will work my way to the New York Times. I got to DC, and I did start on that path. But things changed, and I ended up doing what I call working on every aspect of the sphere of influence. So, when you look at this like circle of influence or cycle of influence, I think that I've served on nearly every piece of it. So I started out as a reporter at Space News, which really scratched my itch for that technical side. And then shortly moved over to Federal Computer Week, and all of that was around, if you remember, the Y2K rollover.
Sure.
And so there was a lot of attention being paid to what does this mean for technology systems, for the computer that I'm sitting in front of right now. Is everything going to shut down tomorrow? And in space, there were similar issues about would these space systems be able to survive a rollover when most of the satellites were built 10 to 15 years prior to Y2K, and no one had ever anticipated what might happen. So I was there. Yeah, I was there for some time. You had a question?
No, I was just saying, absolutely a great time to kind of get into the journalism world and launch your career. But that launch started with your time at the Daily Collegian. So maybe share some memories of your time on the staff at the Daily Collegian. What were the big issues of the day that you were covering there, and some of your favorite stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So my time at the Collegian was amazing. I started my freshman year, and I think I still remember taking the test to become a reporter at the Daily Collegian. And we were given sort of a fake set of facts, and we had to write a story. And somehow I made the cut. But I was one of the campus reporters, and spent a lot of my time covering the Penn State administration. So when Joab Thomas retired, and then Graham Spanier took over as the president of Penn State, I was the primary reporter covering his new administration, and so got to know him. Change is always a time for lots of stories. And so I did a lot of campus reporting, but one of my favorite stories that I did was during one of the elections, and it was I did a number of things during the presidential election. One was that I went out and covered the Reform Party convention, which was in King of Prussia. So I basically got to campus. This was move-in weekend. Moved in my stuff as quickly as possible, and then drove King of Prussia to cover the Reform Party convention, which had a really strong focus on young voters, Gen X. There was a whole section devoted to it. And then I came back and I did a series on third party candidates. And so I looked at the history of third party candidates in politics and the Reform Party, as well as other third parties, many of whom had candidates that came to campus and spoke to the students. So that was one that I was really most interested in and proud of, and I think is a little bit out of the norm maybe for what you would typically see in your campus daily newspaper. My favorite fun story that I ever did was I met with the person who was restoring the Nittany lion, the taxidermy Nittany lion. And so it was in the library at the time, and they were in the process of restoring the lion. And he left me in the room with this bandaged lion and said, like, hold on, I'll be right back. And here I am, learning about how the process works to restore this very special lion. And he leaves me alone. I'm like, oh God, I'm here with this animal. I hope he comes back. But it was a really fun story to do, and one that's just so much in the Penn State pride area. So I really enjoyed doing that too.
That's amazing. I'm fascinated by the third party candidate story in the series that you wrote. What's it going to take for a third party candidate to emerge and win a national election?
Well, I guess I hate to say it, but I think we're pretty close here. I think there's a potential split in the Republican Party that could come in the next few years or earlier. Maybe I guess I would think it would dilute some of the vote. But I do think we're seeing a move towards, sort of extremism and conservatism within the parties, and it is really possible that we could see a split to a third party, here in the near future. Whether that's for the best, I can't really say at this point,
Right.
but
Nor
I
should we
see the
on this podcast, right?
yeah, I mean, one of the other things that I think is so great is that, in the last 2 years, we've seen a higher degree of activism among young voters and
Right.
an interest in issues like Black Lives Matter and security and safety, and I do think that that invigorates the voting base, and we really need that right now. So I'm in favor of voting. I'm working the election in Virginia tomorrow as a volunteer, and really am hopeful that it's all about protecting our democracy. So
Yeah, it's
anyway,
interesting. People talk about polling and how the polls are based on likely voters. I think if a third party is going to emerge, it's going to be unlikely voters that would boost a third party. So it's really hard to tell when one might emerge because of that.
absolutely.
Now, you alluded to the quality of the honors college as one of the reasons why you decided to come to Penn State. So, how did your experience in the honors college prepare you for your career afterwards?
So I think one of the really nice things about the honors college, and the thing that I remember most, is it took an incredibly large university and it gave you a home. It made it a smaller place where you had a community. And I lived in the honors dorm my first 2 years, and that was my family. I mean, these were the people that I spent every day with. There were lots of places where people would congregate just to study or talk or kind of wind down even. But I think one of the things about the honors college is that living there prepared me for how do you develop your community in a very big environment. And so that's one of those sort of lessons for life, things that you take with you. Broader than that, I mean, my classes, I just had opportunities that I think other students didn't necessarily have. When I started, they had, and I don't know if it still exists, but there was a cluster course taught by 3 professors, and it was political science, English, and geography. And so the whole idea was that they were team teaching these three, sort of gen ed level, but honors courses, and they had created, a crossover among them. And so at the end of the semester, what we had done was each team was assigned a project that looked at all, pulled together everything that we had learned, and we visited and had studied different areas of the country. And so it was, Shamokin, um, Reading, Baltimore, and Reston. And so we were looking at sort of this evolution of cities and communities and how industry and changes in industry can evolve, all the way into a planned community like Reston, Virginia. And so I thought it was a really unique approach to teaching that I don't think you necessarily get in your typical non-honors courses, and one that did prepare me because everything is interdisciplinary outside of outside of college. Every single thing pulls together interdisciplinary aspects and cross domains. So I think it really was a good preparation for the future.
This is the People of Penn State podcast. I'm Paul Clifford. I'm joined today by Paula Trimble. She is the Policy Chief and Small Business Programs Director at the Space Development Agency in the U.S. Department of Defense. So you graduate from Penn State in 1998. Can you walk us through your somewhat unusual career path from journalism to government service to lobbying and how you ended up back in the space industry?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it was unique and unexpected. I thought I would be a journalist for life. But shortly after spending the first few years of my career as a reporter, one of the offices that I covered, which was the Office of Space Commercialization at the Department of Commerce, sent me this job announcement for a space policy analyst. And I was like, this looks so cool. I would love to do this. And they said, well, we hope you'll apply. So I applied for that job and moved into government service, surprising my editors and maybe disappointing them a little bit. But I went to work for this office where we were primarily responsible for promoting the commercial growth, or the growth of the commercial space sector. And that was kind of in three different areas. One was space communications, one was commercial remote sensing. So all of the satellite imagery you see on Google Earth today started somewhere in this office, was responsible for promoting the development of that industry. And then, of course, GPS, which was primarily a military capability at that time, but there was a sort of burgeoning civil sector that wanted to use GPS. And then now today we're at the point where everybody uses GPS to get absolutely anywhere because otherwise they probably wouldn't know where they are. And then from there, I moved over to the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, where I was also like a market industry analyst. And the unique thing about that office is they were promoting the commercial launch sector. And if you turn on the news almost every week right now, we have commercial launches from SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic. A lot of the things I was working on at the time there have now come to fruition, and this industry is really at a pivotal point where average citizens can think about being able to go to space in the near future. And so then I moved into a different sector and worked for an aerospace company in their Washington office, and was doing my first stint at lobbying, which at the time I wasn't so sure about. But it turned into a broader career, and it led me actually back to the Department of Defense. So after a little bit of time at Ball Aerospace, I moved back to DoD into this office called the Rapid Reaction Technology Office. And the thing about this office was they were looking to meet very immediate needs, things that needed to be developed and put into action quickly for the warfighter, because it was the post 9/11 period, and the average acquisition cycle in the Department of Defense just wasn't going to cut it for getting real solutions into the hands of our warfighters in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so that was a really exciting place to be. I leveraged all of my skills as a writer because if there's one thing I've learned about every government organization is the ability to write quickly and concisely and convey your very persuasive argument is a highly valued skill, and one where I excelled. And so I think every policy office that I worked in, every technology development office that I worked in, my journalism background was absolutely key to being able to get things done. And so I spent about 8.5 years in that office, and I helped develop new capabilities in unmanned systems that we would test and prototype. I worked a little bit on some space activities as well, and then really in something that has become almost a daily discussion in the world is looking at information and influence, and how DoD conducts information operations or counters misinformation from other adversaries and entities. And so that's something that I worked on several years ago that I think is really in the forefront of the public discussion today. And then I got, after spending a lot of time in that office, I took one of our leaders to a prototyping event on Capitol Hill. And it was sort of eye-opening for me how much innovation was going on in academia, because the majority of the people who were displaying at this event were from academia and working in research labs and actually bringing products and prototypes to the table. And so I was really impressed. One of the companies that hosted that event is Lewis Burke Associates, and they're a small DC-based lobbying firm, woman-owned, that works primarily with universities, scientific societies, and research institutes. And so I ultimately made the decision to join them and got to do government relations here in DC on behalf of academia and some research institutes across the country. So strange career path. And now I'm back in the government. And so after spending about almost 5 years at Lewisburg, I had this opportunity to join the Space Development Agency as their policy chief. And it just seemed to me that it was the right place at the right time and the perfect place to put all of my experience together. So that is the circuitous path that led me here.
Absolutely. I want to stick with your time in higher education lobbying, because that's, it's fascinating to me. Higher education has become politicized over the past, 10, 15, 20 years. But the funding of higher education in terms of, inserting politics into it seems a little different in terms of kind of funding the endeavor versus funding research that happens on college campuses. And you were on the research side. And so can you talk a little bit about lobbying for continued funding to happen at colleges and universities around the country versus other kind of research endeavors?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think when I joined Lewisburg, I had this misconception that all universities were in it together. Right? That everybody was like a kumbaya moment, and every university, was after this pot to increase federal funding for research. And while to some degree that is true, particularly when it comes to basic research, because of the way the federal government, NSF and DoD and DOE, they fund academic research, through sort of programmatic funds. And so those are competitive for all universities. And so there is some degree of collaboration across the community to sort of raise the top line for those research accounts. But what I found was so many research institutions, including Penn State, who I worked very closely with. They were not one of my clients, but they were a partner, are looking at specific areas where they can form relationships with the federal government and be, sort of at the forefront of providing innovative research to the government. And so those areas, tend to be very specific to each university. And that required me to become an expert on all kinds of things like manufacturing technology, energetic materials or explosives, which is not something I ever had worked on before, space technology, um, you know, uh, hypersonics was an area that we spent a lot of time on. And so each university kind of has their niches and areas where they really excel and want to grow the research funding, whether, regardless of which agency it is. I was focused primarily on national security agencies, and so DoD was a primary target for us. And we would basically look at opportunities both to grow those bigger programs. There's some programs called university research initiatives, some that fund equipment for research, some that fund the research themselves, and also look at, specific, now earmarks are back, but when I was working on it, there weren't earmarks. So looking at specific programs that we could increase, from Capitol Hill or from Congress, that would help the department make further investments in those areas. And so, plus ups have been around. Some were programmatic. Now there are some that are a little bit more focused and targeted as community earmarks that help nonprofit institutions. But I found that it was really rewarding to work with the researchers directly and find out, what are their strengths, where is the next breakthrough coming from, and then be able to take them to Capitol Hill and brief their members of Congress and get them excited about what they could do. The flip side of that was that a lot of my work more recently was during the pandemic. And as you all know, universities were hit very hard in many respects, including researchers, because for a period of time, many could not conduct their research. So we worked really closely with both Congress and with the Department of Defense to make sure that there were ways for researchers to continue to get paid, even when they couldn't conduct research, to extend their grants, and give a lot of flexibility so that when they return to campus and return to their research labs, they would be able to execute and deliver on the research that they were funded for. And so that was a really rewarding activity to work on as a lobbyist, because the biggest risk, I think, to our nation and our national security is losing that pipeline of researchers who are working at the cutting edge. And so we really needed to protect them.
So it's interesting, and you may not be able to or be in a position to answer this question, but I wonder if that's the best way to answer some of the questions, some of the world's kind of biggest questions or challenges, right? Find a university that's doing research or has expertise on it and fund one university. Or I think about the development of this vaccine, for example, or some of the other medical research that goes on where it's a consortium of institutions that are sharing data sets and sharing trial results with each other, so that there's more institutions that are involved in trying to solve, kind of the big challenges we face as a world. So, you have experience, I think, on both sides of that. Is funding research at one institution the best way to go about it because there's a specific expertise there, or is crowdsourcing the answers to some of these problems a better approach?
I guess I think there's a balance. And so I think there's a balance because I don't think you will find a researcher out there who says that they work in a vacuum.
Right.
I mean, nearly every researcher has collaborators and competitors at other universities, but a lot of collaborators. I mean, most papers that, basic research papers that are published are multiple authors and many times from multiple institutions. And so I think, the real benefit is drawing on the best and brightest across the country. I will say one of the areas that I think the federal government struggles with is how to pick winners, right? So, there's a responsibility to sort of seed different areas across the country and ensure that there's diversity in research across, states and different academic institutions. But they also want to make sure we're getting the best, right? The major focus right now, I would say nationwide, is the rising power of China, their increasing investments in research and scientific and technical innovation, and their desire to supersede us as a great power in the world. And part of that goes right back to research, where it has been proven time and again that the Chinese have stolen stolen some of our innovation from us. So we have this balance of wanting to protect it, but also we want to ensure that there's international collaboration in our research, because that's how you get to the breakthroughs. That's how you get to the best and brightest. And so we don't want to restrict it so much that we actually hurt ourselves. And so I think there's a balance to be struck between picking lead institutions, maybe where you invest in certain types of research equipment, testing equipment, capabilities, and ensuring and encouraging collaboration. And I think, one area where this happens a lot is to take a large research institution, a top tier research institution, and try to partner them with, historically Black universities, or, minority serving institutions, to help develop capabilities in areas that are underserved. And so that way, we can ensure that it's not just certain pockets of the country that have all of the capability, but that we have a broader industrial base for the future.
So I'd imagine in the worlds that you've worked in, you're running into a lot of engineers, and you've worked with institutions of higher education. I'd imagine that you have a lot of interactions and connections throughout your career with Penn Staters.
I do. We are everywhere. And that's been one of the sort of really wonderful things about being a Penn State graduate, is that I can count, interviews that I've been given as a reporter and for jobs, that because I was a Penn State graduate, and other people who were at that firm were from Penn State, and they always know that they want to bring more Penn Staters on. At my current job, there's our finance One of our finance people went to Penn State, so we often have a lot to talk about.
Right.
And I think, even in my job, I've been exposed to, what's new at Penn State, because when I was at the DoD the first time, several years ago, we were doing a number of projects and funding some work with Penn State Applied Research Laboratory. And so I had opportunities to come back to Penn State and participate in the program reviews, and even got to try out some of the autonomous vehicle equipment up at the research park and at the transportation center. So there's some fun video out there of me, in the truck. But I think what it does is it keeps me connected, and I also attend as many events as I can in DC, where Penn State is hosting or participating. I mean, there's the Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism, which I attend every year that I can, because it helps connect me back to Penn State and back to the college that I went to. But nearly every event that I go to on Capitol Hill, or every meeting, there's usually a Penn Stater in the room somewhere. So I think it's just a really, a pleasant thing. On a personal note, my neighbor across the street, they're Penn Staters, and their son just graduated from Penn State a couple of years ago. So we have an ongoing trade where if one of us goes to campus, we bring back creamery ice cream for the other. And so oftentimes there's a surprise carton of ice cream, which is really nice. Last night for Halloween, he stopped by to say they had gone to the hockey game in Nashville. So and
that's amazing.
they were super excited about the win. So.
That's amazing. An upset victory over the number 6, I think North Dakota State, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so, yeah. But the upset was big. So
big upset. So a good start to our season for the men's hockey program. Paul, let me ask you about the work you're doing today. The newest branch in our military is the Space Force. You work at the Space Development Agency. So can you talk a little bit about Space Force and the relationship with the Space Development Agency and what your mission is?
Yep, absolutely. So the Space Development Agency is a pretty new agency at DoD. It was created in March of 2019. So we're only a couple years into this, and we're just starting to get technologies and satellites launched on orbit. We're about just under a year from the first launch of our what we call our first tranche of satellites. And our mission is to support the joint warfighter and missile defense. And so the capabilities that we're going to deliver from a low Earth orbit constellation are advanced and hypersonic missile tracking and beyond line of sight targeting for moving targets on the ground or at sea. And so those are kind of the two mission focus areas that we have. With that comes a really unique business model. And so this is one of the reasons that I love working at SDA, is because we're doing things differently. We believe that speed is truly important, and getting these capabilities on orbit as quickly as possible is our value proposition. And so we use a spiral development approach. We're going to be launching tranches of satellites every 2 years to advance the capability as quickly as possible. And largely that's drawing on what's going on in commercial industry, really trying to get the most advanced capabilities on orbit for the Department of Defense. Our relationship with the Space Force, who's also brand new and really just in their infancy as well as a service, is currently SDA, Space Development Agency, is a independent defense agency, meaning a lot like DARPA or Missile Defense Agency. We have an independent activity. We run our own acquisitions, and we're really focused on rapidly prototyping and fielding capabilities. Next year, in October of 2022, we will join the Space Force. And so that is because we will be at a point where we've achieved sort of a significant level of operational capability, and we need to be part of a military service so that we can organize, train, and equip and really operate that service for the warfighter. So we think the Space Force is obviously being set up and trying to speed up the way space systems are built and delivered. And SDA is kind of a model organization for that. So when we join, we'll be a fairly independent entity in the Space Force, but we're really looking to kind of set the example for how you can do it faster and how you can do it differently.
So when I think about the space of defense, I think of large companies that get these defense contracts and they are able to build out. But your focus is more on getting more startups and small businesses involved. What does that endeavor look like on a day-to-day basis?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's kind of fun because what we've done is we've tried to create a marketplace by putting out open solicitations every 2 years. That means we are ripe for competition, brand new competition every 2 years, which is very unlike typical defense acquisition where you see the same primes over and over again. And because of their base of experience, they're always sort of favored for the next acquisition. We don't want to get locked in with any one vendor, and I think our first contracts are kind of evidence of that. We awarded our first 10 satellites, our first 20 satellites for what we call Tranche Zero last year, and those went to half and half Lockheed Martin
Right.
and York Space Systems. And York Space Systems is a small satellite manufacturer, commercial company out of Colorado. And so what we showed was that you didn't have to tie it up with one vendor, and it didn't necessarily have to be a big prime. We've got an equal opportunity. We just want the best solution. Also, there's a little bit of internal competition now that they're both delivering satellites.
Right.
Same thing with our next slate of satellites. We've got SpaceX and L3Harris working on those. So you've got a more traditional manufacturer, and then SpaceX, who's been building rockets but is sort of new to the satellite manufacturing space. And then we have what I work on in my spare time is a small business program that's all our own. And so what we have done is taken our most hard-pressing technical challenges and built a program where we solicit from small businesses and independent nonprofit research institutes through 2 DoD programs
Right.
for solutions to those technical challenges. And those are things like, how do we do really good mesh networking in space? How do we incorporate cybersecurity into our system? How do we utilize AI for automated target recognition? So those are some of the topics that we've had already, but those are geared specifically towards small and non-traditional businesses and research institutions, because we want to make sure that we're getting the latest and greatest technology and that we're solving our technical challenges, because these are real things. They're going to go on orbit.
We've been putting satellites up into space since the 50s and 60s, and yet it seems like there has been a renaissance in the space industry just over the past decade. Can you talk about the challenges that you all foresee in terms of the workforce being able to keep up with how fast the industry is moving?
Yeah, I think this is a concern. This is a concern for everybody who's involved in aerospace, whether they're government, military, civilian space, or in industry, which is that we need to ensure that there is a pipeline of workers who are interested in helping support these activities in space. I think the stand up of the Space Force in and of itself is somewhat reinvigorating and excitement about space in the military. I don't think you're ever going to have a shortage of people who are interested in NASA space exploration and things going on there. But it is tough to attract people, to the space sector, and it's something that we're really focused on, because the only way we're going to be successful at doing it quickly is by getting people interested in the field,
Right.
making sure that we have aerospace engineers, that we have experts in materials, that we have folks who are trained in optics, and we really need those highly skilled areas to be producing researchers and engineers to go into the workforce. And so that's something that I think we're all focused on, is trying to explain what we do, explain how it impacts people's daily lives, and that national security is everybody's security,
Right.
and that we really need people to to join, whether it's in a military, civilian, or a commercial capacity. We can only advance in the world if we continue to have a pipeline.
Now, when I hear tranche zero and I hear tranches of satellites going up, I'm an amateur at all this. And I don't know a lot about this, but I think when you talk about low Earth orbit, right, it sounds like a crowded place. So, what are some of the kind of ethical and environmental concerns that you all deal with in terms of space debris and things of that nature?
Yeah, a lot of times you will hear people talk about space as increasingly congested, contested. It is becoming congested, and there are mega constellations of commercial satellites to provide broadband capabilities across the country and around the world that are going up right now. Our constellation, which ideally might have about 400 satellites, is not among the largest, but certainly contributes to the congested nature of space. And so there is a broad-based discussion going on across the government and with our international partners about how to be responsible in space, right? Norms of behavior, tenets of behavior for responsible activities in space. And I think one of the things that SDA is concerned with, and many of our partners, is how do we do a better job of mitigating the impacts of putting a lot of stuff up and making sure that we have good collision avoidance technology, that we deorbit things on schedule, and that we don't just leave space junk, as they call it, in space. And so from SDA's perspective, we kind of have, two halves of the coin. One half is, what is the impact of all of these other proliferated constellations on our national security constellation? What potential debris risks are there to our system, which the warfighter needs, and they need to get data, on a very timely basis. So we need to make sure there are not impacts to that. But also, how do we mitigate and be responsible about the satellites we're deploying, and ensure that as we launch new tranches, that the satellites that have outlived their useful life are naturally deorbiting and coming out. So there is a lot of discussion about that. We are just one small piece, but it is something we're thinking about.
It's interesting. You were talking about your work with universities on the research side, and I think of the transfer of technology from and of intellectual property from research at universities to the Department of Defense. But then there are times where some of that research becomes publicly available. We were talking before we went on camera about your work at the Department of Commerce when GPS was just being made publicly available. Can you talk about how something goes from being specifically designed for government use or for military use? I think the internet, I think GPS, right, are probably two of the most readily accessible examples, and how that becomes available for the general public?
Yeah, I mean, I think with GPS, it's a really nice story, which is that GPS was initially purpose built for the military, but as the capability advanced, they found that there were ways to make it available publicly, and as long as we could protect the military's portion of GPS, we could allow an entire sector to develop that utilizes positioning, navigation, and timing from these satellites. And so a lot of the work I did at Commerce was looking at that civil sector, whether it's people doing geodetic survey, or whether it's your Google Maps, and
Right.
letting you do all commercial transactions at the pump with GPS based timing. So we were looking at ways to make that available, and the industry is exponentially taken off since then, because we found ways to both protect the military portion and make a large portion available for commercial use. And that's been a huge success story. I mean, it just, I don't think there's anybody out there who lives without GPS somewhere in their daily life, even
Right.
if they don't know it. And I think that we are at a point where we're actually, as a government, going to gain more from what's going on in the private sector in space, and by leveraging that and bringing it into government systems than the other way around. I mean, I think it's pretty widely recognized in a lot of technical areas. The commercial sector is out ahead of us. There's a large degree of private investment that's going into these broadband satellite constellations, weather-related space-based efforts that help with climate monitoring and hopefully with reversing the impacts of climate change. I think there's a lot for us to gain from what's going on commercially right now. And that's one of the hallmarks of the office that I'm in, is that we're looking on a continual basis at what advanced space capabilities are in the private sector and how can we then adapt them or just use them as an augmentation to our system.
This is the People of Penn State podcast. I'm Paul Clifford. Today I'm joined by Paula Trimble. Paula is the Policy Chief and Small Business Programs Director at the Space Development Agency at the U.S. Department of Defense. Well, Paula, we like to have a little bit of fun here at the end of each episode. So I have a couple quick hitter questions that I'm going to throw at you, and you just share the first thing that comes to mind. So your favorite class at Penn State?
Ooh, I had a lot of favorite classes, but I think my favorite class I was an art history minor, and I took the Art of Cezanne class, and that was probably my favorite class. Professor Crumrine, who I'm sure is long retired, was an absolute expert on Cezanne and just really did an amazing job, teaching us about her love. And years later, I finally got to go to the Barnes in Philadelphia and see all of the Cezannes that she had talked about. So that to me was probably one of my most fun classes.
The Barnes has a wonderful collection of Cezannes. We did an event there a number of years ago with Alumni Council. And so if you are in the Philadelphia area or if you're just a fan of art, the Barnes Museum is a must-stop if you're a fan of Cezanne. Wonderful collection there. If you could have dinner with anyone, who would it be and why?
Ooh. That's a really hard question. I actually am going to go really off the map here. I think it would be Paul McCartney. I am a huge Beatles fan, and would love to just hear all of the stories about starting the Beatles and just his entire life. I think I'm so impressed by him because even at his advanced age, he can do a 4-hour show, and that is something that I would strive to be able to stand for 4 hours at his age.
Yeah, that he's amazing. Have you seen the movie Yesterday?
Yes, I have.
Wonderful movie.
Absolutely.
Your most unusual "we are" moment, someplace where you heard "we are" or you said it, where you didn't expect to run into another Penn Stater.
I think I always expect to run into a Penn Stater, so I can't say that I have been surprised, but I think it's more been I've surprised other people where I'm walking around at some event or in the halls of Congress, and there's somebody with a Penn State shirt on or a Penn State hat or a pin, and I'll go, "We are!" And I think I've often surprised other people, but if anybody says it, I instantly respond, Penn State.
That's amazing. How about your favorite Penn State sport?
My favorite Penn State sport is probably football, but I admitted to you before this that I'm not the biggest football fan. I'm not the biggest sports fan, period. But my favorite class that I took my other favorite class that I took at Penn State was ice skating, figure skating. So while there's no Penn State figure skating, I really loved that we had an ice rink.
Do you remember who your professor was?
No, I don't.
I'm trying to think of his name. If it was we have a world famous fly fisherman who was on the faculty at Penn State and taught fly fishing, but he told me the other class that he taught was figure skating.
Oh wow!
So
Yeah,
I wonder if it was him.
It was so long ago, but it was like the greatest break to your day, like a totally different thing to go to the ice rink and take this class. So I still was a pitiful figure skater, but I really enjoyed it.
Amazing. All right. and you told the story about creamery ice cream and your neighbor across the street. What is your favorite flavor of creamery ice cream?
WPSU coffee break.
Oh, excellent. That's my favorite as well. My favorite as well.
Anytime that was in the dining hall, I was happy.
Well, Paula, thank you so much for joining us on the People of Penn State podcast and for allowing us to share your story with fellow Penn Staters.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it, and hope that people will reach out if they ever want to get in touch.
And if you like this episode, I hope that you'll subscribe to the People of Penn State podcast in your favorite podcast app of choice. And while you're there, go ahead and give us a rating and drop us a review. Help us spread the word. Share the podcast with friends and fellow Penn Staters via your social media channels. And be sure to tag the Penn State Alumni Association with @PennStateAlums. If you're a member of the Penn State Alumni Association, thank you so much for your support. If you're not, what are you waiting for? Visit our website at alumni.psu.edu, and you too can become a member of the world's largest alumni association. Thank you for listening, and thanks for all you do for the university, for the glory, and for the future. We are.
When we stood at childhood's gate, shapeless in the hands of fate, thou didst mold us, dear old state, dear old state.